The wind howling down the Bitter Creek Valley didn't just carry the scent of pine. It carried the sharp, metallic smell of snow. It was November 1877 in the Wyoming Territory, a place where the landscape was vast, beautiful, and trying its best to kill you. While every other settler in the valley was frantically banking earth against their log cabins and stuffing moss between timber cracks to survive the coming freeze, Sarah Miller was doing something that made the townsfolk stop their wagons and stare. The 32-year-old widow was standing waist-deep in a pit, swinging a pickaxe into the frozen ground with a rhythm born of desperation. She wasn't building up, she was digging down. Her daughter, 6-year-old Emily, sat nearby on a pile of excavated clay, wrapped in a threadbare wool coat, watching her mother with silent, trusting eyes. To the people of Bitter Creek, it looked like a scene of madness. A woman digging her own grave before winter even truly began. A shadow fell across the pit. It was Thomas Big Tom Garrett, the valley's wealthiest cattle rancher. He pulled his chestnut mare to a halt, looking down at Sarah with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Mrs. Miller?" Tom drawled, his voice rough like gravel. "I've seen folks do strange things out here, but this takes the prize. You're excavating a pit in frozen ground, no wood stove, no chimney. You trying to freeze that little girl to death?" Sarah wiped a streak of clay from her forehead and looked up, squinting against the pale winter sun. "We won't freeze, Mr. Garrett." "You're digging a hole, Sarah, a root cellar," Tom scoffed, leaning over his saddle horn. "You need a cabin. You need timber walls and a cast-iron stove. This is Wyoming. The cold here gets into the rock itself." "My father was a copper miner in Michigan," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion trembling in her arms. "He taught me that the earth breathes. Cold sinks, heat rises. But deep down, the earth stays constant." She pointed her pickaxe at the dirt floor of her excavation. 20 feet down, Mr. Garrett. That's the magic number. At 20 feet, the earth holds a steady 55 degrees, winter or summer. It's warm enough to keep water from freezing, and warm enough to keep us alive. Tom shook his head, adjusting his Stetson. "Physics don't care about your theories, ma'am. You're gambling your lives on a miner's tale. When the blizzards come, and they will come, don't say I didn't warn you." He spurred his horse and rode off toward town, leaving Sarah and Emily alone in the biting wind. Sarah looked at the darkening sky. She knew the town called her crazy. She knew they whispered that grief had taken her mind. But as she looked at the raw earth, she didn't see a grave. She saw a fortress. "Come on, Emily," Sarah whispered, lifting the pickaxe again. "Let's show them." The Wyoming earth didn't give up its secrets easily. What started as topsoil quickly turned into hardpan, a brutal layer of compressed clay and rock that had been undisturbed for centuries. For the next 3 weeks, time in Bitter Creek was measured not by hours, but by the dull thud of Sarah's pickaxe hitting the ground. Sarah and Emily worked like ghosts in the gray light of dawn. While the other settlers were frantically chopping cordwood, stacking it high against their cabin walls to feed their voracious iron stoves, Sarah was mixing mud. She wasn't just digging a hole. She was engineering a lung for the earth. "Watch closely, Em," Sarah said one afternoon, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She was kneeling on the floor of the finished excavation 12 feet down. She held a clay pipe she had special ordered from the mercantile, ignoring the confused stares of the shopkeeper. "This isn't just a pipe, it's how the house breathes." She installed 2 shafts. One started at the surface and ran down to the floor, the intake. The other started at the ceiling and ran straight up, the exhaust. "Cold air is heavy," Sarah explained, wiping her bloodied hands on her apron. "It sinks down this pipe, hits the warm floor, and heats up. Warm air is light, so it rises out the other pipe. We don't need a fan. We don't need a fire. The earth does the work." To seal the floor, Sarah used an old miner's trick she'd seen her father use, a mixture of clay, sand, and ox blood she'd begged from the local butcher. When it dried, it was hard as concrete and smooth as leather. By mid-December, the structure was complete. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a mound of dirt with a heavy timber door built into the hillside. No chimney poked through the snow, no smoke curled into the sky. On the ridge overlooking the valley, Big Tom Garrett sat on his horse, watching the strange, silent dwelling. The wind had picked up, screaming down from the mountains with a ferocity that promised a killer freeze. He adjusted his collar, shivering despite his heavy buffalo hide coat. "She's finished it," he muttered to his foreman. "She's built a tomb and climbed inside. Should we ride down, check on 'em?" the foreman asked, eyeing the darkening clouds. Tom shook his head, his jaw set. "She made her choice. You can't save folks who don't want saving. That ground is going to freeze solid tonight. If they're in that hole without a stove, they'll be gone by morning." The storm hit that evening. It was a whiteout, a wall of snow that erased the world. In the town, families huddled around their roaring stoves, feeding wood into the fire every hour, yet still feeling the frost creeping across the floorboards. Down in the earth shelter, Sarah bolted the heavy door shut. The wind howled outside, battering the timber, but the sound was muffled, distant. She struck a match and lit a single oil lamp. The golden light washed over the smooth clay walls. Sarah looked at the thermometer hanging by the door. Outside, it was 10 degrees below zero and dropping. Inside, the mercury sat unwavering at 56 degrees. "Mama," Emily whispered, clutching her doll, "is the storm here?" "It is, baby," Sarah said softly, pulling a quilt over the sleeping platform carved into the earth. "But it can't find us here." She lit a bundle of sage and held it near the floor intake. The smoke didn't swirl chaotically. Instead, it drifted lazily across the floor, warmed up, and rose toward the ceiling vent in a perfect, invisible current. The physics held. The machine was working. While Bitter Creek froze, fighting a war against the winter, Sarah Miller blew out the lamp. For the first time in months, she slept in the absolute silent embrace of the earth. January arrived not with a whimper, but with a roar that shook the foundations of Bitter Creek. The blizzard that hammered the valley was relentless, a white wolf that scratched at every door and window, demanding entry. At the Garrett Ranch, the envy of the valley, life had become a waking nightmare. Big Tom's cabin was a fortress of hewn timber and stone, the kind of house that signaled wealth and stability. But physics was a cruel mistress. The massive iron stove in the center of the main room roared day and night, consuming cords of wood that Tom and his hands had spent all summer chopping. Yet, water in the wash basin froze solid just 10 feet away from the fire. Tom paced the floorboards in his heavy boots, his breath visible in the air of his own living room. The drafts were like invisible knives, slicing through the chinking in the logs. Every hour was a battle. Wake up, stoke the fire, check the windows, shiver, repeat. "Daddy, I'm cold," 4-year-old Danny whimpered from the pile of buffalo robes near the hearth. His voice was thin, reedy. Tom knelt, rubbing his son's small, blue-tinged hands. The boy's skin felt clammy. A dry, hacking cough had settled into Danny's chest a week ago, and the dry, smoky air from the stove was only making it worse. "I know, son. I'm feeding the fire. It'll get warm soon." It was a lie. It never got warm. The heat went straight up the chimney, leaving the family huddling in a smoky, freezing box, exhausted by the sheer effort of staying alive. Less than a mile away, buried beneath the howling wind, a completely different world existed. If Tom's cabin was a chaotic battleground, Sarah Miller's earth shelter was a cathedral of silence. 20 feet down, the screaming wind was nothing more than a dull, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat. Sarah sat in her rocking chair, mending a tear in Emily's dress. The air in the room was still and impossibly fresh. The thermometer on the clay wall read a steady 58 degrees. It wasn't tropical, but compared to the 20 below zero chaos on the surface, it felt like spring. There was no draft, no smoke. The clay walls, having soaked up the Earth's thermal energy for millennia, acted like a massive, gentle radiator. They held the heat and released it slowly, wrapping the mother and daughter in a blanket of warmth that didn't fluctuate. Emily lay on her stomach on the packed earth floor, a floor that felt warm to the touch, drawing pictures in the dust with a stick. She wore only a light sweater. "Mama," Emily asked, looking up, "is Mr. Tom cold?" Sarah paused, her needle hovering over the fabric. She pictured the smoke pouring frantically from the Garrett chimney. "Yes, baby, I'm afraid he is." "Why doesn't he come here?" "Because," Sarah sighed. "Sometimes men would rather freeze in a house they understand than be warm in a hole they don't." Up on the surface, Tom stood by his frosted window, scraping a peephole in the ice. He looked toward the draw where Sarah's land was. The snow had drifted 6 feet high. There was no sign of a door, no smoke, no life. Just a smooth, white blanket covering where the widow and her child used to be. "Damn fool woman," Tom whispered, his heart heavy with a guilt he couldn't quite name. He turned back to his shivering son and threw another log into the fire, unaware that the only thing dead in that valley was his pride. The crisis broke 3 nights later, not with a bang, but with a terrifying rattle in a small boy's chest. Danny's fever had spiked to a dangerous high. His skin was burning dry, yet his small body shook violently under the pile of buffalo robes. The Garrett cabin was freezing. The wind had found a new gap in the chinking, and a drift of fine snow was accumulating in the corner of the room, just feet from where the child lay dying. "He can't breathe, Tom," his wife screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "The stove isn't enough. The cold is in his lungs." Big Tom Garrett stood paralyzed. The road to the doctor in town was impassable, a suicide run in this weather. But staying here meant watching his son suffocate in the icy grip of their proper home. Then he remembered. Not the arguments, not the pride, but the physics. Constant temperature, she had said. 55 degrees. "Wrap him up," Tom commanded, his voice hollow. "Tight." "Where are you going? You'll kill him." "I'm taking him to the widow." Tom didn't wait for an argument. He bundled Danny into his coat, shielding the boy's face with his own chest, and plunged out into the white abyss. The ride was a blur of adrenaline and freezing blindness. The horse stumbled through belly-deep drifts, fighting the gale that threatened to knock them flat. Tom couldn't see the trail, but he saw something else. A faint, ghostly pillar of steam rising from the snowbank on the hillside. It was the exhaust vent. The warm air from below was meeting the frozen night, creating a beacon of life. "She's alive." Tom threw himself off the horse and scrambled up the drift, hammering his gloved fists against the buried timber door. "Sarah, open the door. For God's sake, open up." The latch clicked. The door swung inward. Tom fell into the room, bracing himself for the biting wind to follow him. But it didn't. The moment the heavy door thudded shut behind him, the roaring world vanished. Silence. The silence was the first thing that hit him. No howling wind, no crackling fire, just a profound, earthen stillness. Then came the warmth. It wasn't the searing, stinging heat of a wood stove that burns your face while your back freezes. It was a gentle, heavy warmth that wrapped around him like a blanket. It smelled of clean clay and dried sage. "Put him here," Sarah said. She didn't ask questions. She didn't look triumphantly at the desperate man who had mocked her. She simply pointed to the sleeping platform where Emily was sitting up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Tom laid Danny down on the straw mattress. He stripped off the boy's heavy outer layers. Sarah placed a hand on Danny's forehead and then pulled the quilt up to his chin. "The walls," Sarah whispered, pressing a damp cloth to the boy's brow. "They radiate the heat back. His body doesn't have to fight the cold anymore. It can just rest." Tom backed away, his legs shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, but from shock. He pulled off his gloves and touched the clay wall. It was cool to the touch, yet the room felt alive. The thermometer read 59 degrees. Slowly, the terrifying rattle in Danny's breathing began to smooth out. The violent shivering stopped. The boy's tense muscles relaxed into the even, constant temperature of the earth. Big Tom Garrett slid down the wall until he hit the floor. He sat there in the dim lantern light, surrounded by the smell of earth. The same earth he had cursed for being frozen. The same earth he had tried to conquer with axes and fire. He looked at Sarah, who was calmly humming a lullaby to his son and her daughter. Tears cut clean tracks through the soot and frost on his face. "I thought you were dead," he choked out. "I thought I was the smart one." Sarah looked at him, her eyes soft in the lamplight. "The earth doesn't care who is smart, Tom. It just is. You just have to know how to ask it for help." Outside, the storm raged on, burying the valley. But underground, in the womb of the hill, the boy slept soundly, safe in the warmth that had been there since the beginning of time. The fever broke on the fourth morning, dissolving like mist under a rising sun. When Danny Garrett finally opened his eyes and asked for a cup of water, the sound was sweeter to Big Tom than any church choir he'd ever heard. For 8 days, the Garrett family stayed underground. Outside, the Wyoming winter raged, burying fences and freezing cattle where they stood. Inside, life was quiet, rhythmic, and impossibly warm. Tom watched Sarah Miller move through her earthen home with a grace that shamed him. He watched her check the thermometer, adjust the vents, and bake bread on a brazier that used a handful of charcoal instead of a forest of timber. He realized then that he hadn't just been fighting the cold. He'd been fighting the truth. When the storm finally lifted and the sky turned a bruising purple, Tom stood at the door, hat in hand. The arrogance that had defined him was gone, replaced by a raw, dusty humility. "I spent 14 years fighting this land," Tom said, his voice rough. "I built 3 cabins, burned enough wood to clear a forest, and nearly lost my boy. And the whole time, the answer was 20 feet under my boots." He looked at Sarah. "Will you teach me? Will you show us how to build?" "I'll teach anyone who asks," Sarah replied. Spring in Bitter Creek didn't sound like it usually did. For years, April was the sound of axes hitting timber, the frantic noise of men preparing for the next war with winter. But in 1878, the valley echoed with a different sound, the dull, steady thud of pickaxes hitting clay. It started with the Garretts, then the Millers, then the Smiths. By the time the first snow fell the following October, 19 families had moved underground. The town that had mocked the Mad Widow had become a settlement of the earth. That winter, the smoke stopped rising from the valley chimneys, but the people stayed warm. Sarah Miller lived another 38 years in that hillside. She never bought another cord of wood. She never woke up shivering. She raised Emily in a home that cost nothing to heat and everything to understand. When she passed, she left behind not a crumbling ruin, but a legacy carved into the bedrock itself. Decades later, when modern architects began using terms like geothermal mass and passive solar, the people of Bitter Creek just smiled. They knew it wasn't new. It was just the wisdom of a woman who knew that you don't fight nature. You partner with it. She proved that sometimes the strongest shelter isn't the one that stands tall against the wind, but the one that knows when to kneel. If you had to build a home today to survive a disaster without electricity or modern technology, would you trust the old ways like Sarah or rely on what you know like Tom? Tell me your survival plan in the comments below. And if this story warmed your heart, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you stories of resilience, history, and the human spirit every week. Don't miss the next one.